I booked the place because it looked simple and quiet. The listing was short, said it was a small house, perfect for one person, and the host claimed he lived off-site. The price was lower than most of the other options in the area, and the photos showed a clean kitchen, a small living room, and a comfortable bedroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough for a few nights. I was tired from traveling and didn't want to overthink it. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made myself some food, and watched a little television before going to bed. The house seemed older than it looked in the photos. The floors creaked with nearly every step, and the windows rattled faintly when the wind picked up outside. Still, nothing unusual for an old rental. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that pulled me from sleep. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but it wasn't random. It was the distinct creak of a door opening slowly, then the soft thump of it shutting again. I held my breath, listening. A few seconds later came another noise, this one sharper, the fridge door opening. The suction sound of the seal breaking was unmistakable. Then silence, then a soft clatter like a dish being set down. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. I tried convincing myself that maybe I had left the fridge door open earlier, or maybe some appliance was making the sound. But the fridge door closing and opening was too specific. I lay awake for nearly an hour before finally drifting back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I went into the kitchen. My stomach dropped when I saw the sink. There were dirty dishes stacked inside. Plates, a bowl, and a fork, none of which were mine. I hadn't cooked anything that required them. I had only used a glass of water the night before, and I remembered washing and drying it before bed. These dishes weren't mine. I stood there staring at them for too long, trying to explain it away. Maybe the cleaner had left them there. Maybe the host forgot to clear them before I checked in. But I had booked it last minute, and the place looked spotless when I arrived. There was no dust on the counters. The bed had been freshly made, and the bathroom smelled like bleach. The dishes were too fresh to have been sitting there from before. That second night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. I heard the floors creak again, faintly, as though someone was walking barefoot down the hallway. A cupboard door opened at some point, followed by the scrape of something being moved across the counter. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone, but I never found the courage to step out and check. The house was small, and the thought of running into someone inside it while I was half asleep was unbearable. By morning, I had convinced myself I needed to search the place. I told myself I'd feel better if I just checked everything thoroughly. I started with the obvious: closets, the bathroom, under the bed. Everything looked normal. It wasn't until I went into the laundry room that I noticed something strange. One of the panels along the far wall looked different from the rest. The wood was a slightly different shade, and there was a faint outline around it, like it had been opened before. At first, I thought it was just for utilities, maybe access to pipes or wiring. But when I pressed on it, the panel gave slightly, and with a little force, it swung inward. Behind it was a narrow wooden staircase leading down. The air that drifted up from the opening was colder and smelled faintly of mildew. I stood there, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I considered shutting it and pretending I hadn't seen it, but something in me needed to know. I turned on my phone flashlight and started down the steps. The basement was unfinished, with exposed beams and concrete walls. The space was bigger than I expected, stretching under the entire house. My light swept over piles of old furniture, some covered with sheets, some bare and coated in dust. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was a mattress on the ground, laid out on top of a few old rugs. Next to it sat a small lamp, a backpack, and a pair of shoes. The lamp was plugged into an extension cord that snaked across the floor to a power strip. There were food wrappers and an empty water bottle tossed carelessly near the mattress, and a folded blanket lay at the foot of it, like someone had slept there recently. I backed up slowly, trying to process what I was seeing. The host had said he lived off-site, but it was clear he had been sleeping down here. The noises at night, the fridge opening, the dirty dishes. It all made sense now. He hadn't left the property. He had been in the house the whole time, moving quietly between the basement and the upstairs when he thought I was asleep. Panic rushed through me. I went back up the stairs and shoved the panel shut. I didn't want him to know I had found it. I packed my things quickly, every sound of my suitcase zipper feeling too loud in the quiet house. My hands shook as I shoved everything into my bag. Before leaving, I stood in the living room for a moment, trying to decide if I should confront him, or at least leave a note. But the thought of him possibly being somewhere nearby, maybe even listening, made my skin crawl. Instead, I grabbed my bag, unlocked the front door, and walked out as calmly as I could. I didn't run, but every step toward my car felt heavier, like at any second he might appear in the doorway behind me. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My eyes stayed on the house the entire time, waiting to see movement in the windows, some sign of him realizing I had discovered his setup. But the house stayed still, just an old rental sitting quietly in the morning light. I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tight. When I was a few miles down the road, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I never contacted the host, never left a review, never explained why I left early. I didn't want him to know how much I had seen. Later, when I thought about it, I realized how bad it could have been. He had access to me while I slept. He had been walking around, opening the fridge, using the kitchen, while I was in the next room unaware. The dishes in the sink, the footsteps at night, the hidden basement. It wasn't some mistake or oversight. He had chosen to lie about living off-site, and he had been inside that house with me the whole time. I never booked another rental without triple-checking the details again. That stay was supposed to be a cheap, quiet place for a few nights. Instead, it left me with the sickening knowledge that I had been sharing a house with someone who hid just out of sight, watching and waiting in the same space I thought I had to myself. When I booked the Airbnb, it looked like the perfect place. The photos online showed a clean and modern apartment, white walls, polished wooden floors, everything set neatly in place. The reviews all said the same thing: spotless, quiet, comfortable. I arrived in the late afternoon, and when I stepped inside, I was almost surprised at how flawless it looked in person. It didn't feel lived in, though it felt staged, like something from a real estate showing. There wasn't a single out-of-place object, no dust, no marks on the walls, not even the usual scratches you'd expect in a rental. The sheets were tucked so tightly it looked like they had never been slept in. Even the fruit bowl on the counter had perfectly arranged green apples, all the same size. On the nightstand in the bedroom, there was one framed photo. It showed a family of 4, all smiling. A man, a woman, and 2 kids sitting in the grass, squinting against the sun. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Some owners like to leave a personal touch, and the picture seemed harmless enough. The first night was quiet. I unpacked, showered, and went straight to bed. The mattress was firm, and I slept without interruption. The next morning, I left early to go sightseeing. When I got back that evening, the apartment was just as clean as when I left, but something felt slightly different. I couldn't place it right away. Then, as I set my keys down on the nightstand, I noticed the framed picture again. The same family was there, but their smiles weren't as wide. It wasn't something obvious, just a subtle shift. The corners of their mouths weren't pulled up as high. The father's grin looked almost forced, and the kids weren't squinting from the sun anymore. They just looked straight at the camera. I stared at it longer than I meant to, then brushed it off. Maybe I hadn't paid enough attention the first time. The second night, I slept fine again, though I kept thinking about that picture. The family's faces kept drifting into my head when I closed my eyes. The next day, I went out again, gone most of the afternoon. When I came back, I dropped onto the bed without turning on the lights. When I finally did, I saw the picture again. My stomach tightened. The family wasn't smiling at all anymore. They were still sitting in the same spot, still arranged the same way, but their faces were blank, their mouths straight lines. The mother's eyes looked heavier, like she hadn't slept. The kids looked empty. Their faces were pale, washed out, as if the sun was gone from the background. I sat on the bed staring at it, trying to figure out how it was possible. It was the same frame, the same size, the same photo, just different expressions. I told myself maybe it was some trick of light, or maybe the glass over the photo was catching shadows in a strange way. But deep down, I knew what I saw. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking someone had been in the apartment while I was gone. The idea crawled through my head no matter how many times I tried to push it away. The place had been too clean from the start, almost like it was being reset every day. By the third day, I felt uneasy leaving, but I had already planned to spend most of it outside. I left, walked around the city, distracted myself as much as I could, and only came back once the sun had gone down. I unlocked the door and felt that same strange heaviness when I stepped inside, like the air was thicker somehow. The apartment looked untouched. Everything was still in its place. But when I entered the bedroom, I froze. The framed picture on the nightstand wasn't of the family anymore. It was of me. I was lying in the very bed I was standing next to, my head turned to the side, eyes closed, asleep. The angle of the shot was perfect, like it had been taken from the corner of the room. For a long moment, I just stared. My throat was tight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like the sound filled the room. The sheets in the picture were the same sheets under my hands. My bag was visible in the photo too, half unzipped in the corner. It was a picture of me, sleeping in that exact room, sometime within the last 2 nights. I picked it up with shaking hands, looking for any sign it was fake, but it was printed on real photo paper, sealed behind the glass. The edges of the frame were worn in the same places as before. This wasn't swapped out for a cheap copy. Whoever had taken it had been in the room with me while I slept. I backed out of the bedroom, my eyes darting to every corner of the apartment. The closets were empty, the bathroom was clean, the kitchen spotless. I checked under the bed, behind the shower curtain, even in the hallway outside the unit. Nothing, no one, just silence pressing against my ears. But I couldn't ignore the photo. Someone had to have a key. Someone had come in while I was asleep. Maybe it was the owner, maybe not, but whoever it was had stood there long enough to take pictures of me in bed. I grabbed my bag and started stuffing everything inside without caring about order. I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting to hear the creak of a floorboard, the sound of a door opening. The place was silent except for my hurried breathing and the sound of my clothes being shoved into the bag. Once I had everything, I left the photo face down on the nightstand and rushed out. The hallway felt endless, every step echoing too loudly. When I reached the front door of the building, I didn't look back. I walked straight to my car and drove off without even putting in the address of where I was going. I ended up in a hotel across the city. It was old and not nearly as clean, but I didn't care. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and didn't sleep much that night anyway. My mind kept going back to the picture, to the family, to the way their smiles had faded, night after night, until it was me lying there. The next morning, I reported the listing to the site. I didn't explain all the details, just said I felt unsafe and suspected the host was entering the property without permission. They told me they'd investigate, but I never checked to see if the listing was still up. I kept the photo burned into my head though. The thought that someone stood over me, camera in hand, watching me sleep. The worst part wasn't even that they came in. It was knowing they had probably been there more than once, standing in the dark while I never woke up. I don't rent AIRBNBs anymore. I stick to hotels, even the rundown ones. At least then I know the cameras are supposed to be in the hallways, not hidden in smoke detectors or picture frames. And if someone comes into my room, it's because I let them in. But even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, convinced there's someone standing at the edge of the bed, waiting for me to close my eyes again. I booked an Airbnb in the countryside after finding it listed cheap compared to other places in the area. The photos showed a small house with white paint that looked a little worn, surrounded by a field and trees. It was advertised as quiet and peaceful, perfect for someone looking to get away for a few days. I wanted a break, some time alone, and the price pulled me in. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The drive out there took longer than I thought. The road narrowed the farther I went, until it was just a cracked 2-lane path through woods and farmland. I passed fewer houses as I went deeper in, and by the time I reached the address, there wasn't much around except trees, tall grass, and a single dirt driveway leading up to the house. It sat back from the road, partly hidden by a few big oaks. When I pulled in, the first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. No cars went by. I didn't even hear birds, just the crunch of my tires on gravel and the ticking of the engine after I turned it off. The house itself was small, 2 stories, with faded paint and a roof that looked older than it should. But it matched the pictures, so I grabbed my bag and walked up to the porch. The host was waiting for me. She was a middle-aged woman with short hair and a plain dress. She didn't talk much, just handed me the key, told me the basics about the kitchen and bathroom, and left. She didn't even stick around to make sure I settled in, which I found odd but didn't think much of at the time. I assumed she lived nearby, maybe in one of the houses I had passed. Inside, the place was simple. Old furniture, mismatched chairs, a couch that sagged in the middle. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood, like no one had opened a window in a while. My room was on the first floor, tucked into the corner. The bedspread looked clean enough, and the window overlooked the yard, though the curtain was stiff when I tried to move it. By late evening, I had cooked something simple in the small kitchen, sat outside for a while, and then came back in when the light dropped. There wasn't much to do except read, so I turned in early. The countryside was supposed to be quiet, and it was too quiet. The silence pressed in when I lay down, like the whole world had gone empty. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place right away. At first I thought it was just the house creaking, but then I realized it was more deliberate. Shuffling, uneven footsteps. They were coming from above me. I lay still, staring at the ceiling. The listing hadn't mentioned anyone else living there, and the host had said nothing about upstairs. The footsteps moved slowly, like someone pacing, back and forth. Stop, then start again. I listened until they faded, or maybe I fell asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses make noises, maybe raccoons in the attic, something like that. I brushed it off. The second night, it happened again. The same dragging footsteps directly above my room. Slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. I sat up this time, watching the ceiling like I could see through it. My heart pounded, but I didn't move. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, stayed up there longer that night. I didn't sleep until the noise stopped and the sun started to come up. By daylight, the whole thing felt distant, almost like I imagined it. But the heaviness under my eyes reminded me I hadn't dreamed it. That morning, when I went outside, I looked up at the second floor. Curtains covered the windows. They looked like they hadn't been touched in years, stiff and faded. The host had said nothing about anyone else staying there. I wondered if maybe she kept storage up there. That thought carried me through the day, but by the third night, when the footsteps came back, moving back and forth in that same slow rhythm, I couldn't shake the unease anymore. I couldn't explain why I felt certain it wasn't animals. It sounded too human, too intentional. I wanted to leave, but it was the middle of the night, pitch dark outside, and the roads had no lights. I forced myself to stay in bed, clutching the blanket tight and waiting for morning. When daylight finally came, I went out again. Something in me wanted proof, some sign that it was just my imagination. I stepped out onto the gravel, squinting up at the second story. That was when I saw it. One of the curtains moved. Not much, just a small shift, like someone had brushed past it. I froze. My mouth went dry. Then I saw it clearly. A face pressed to the glass. Pale eyes fixed down toward me. Just for a second, then the curtain fell back into place. I stood there in the yard, not breathing, not moving, until I finally forced myself to go back inside. I packed my bag and walked straight out the door without looking up again. I drove off the property and didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station miles away. When I finally checked my phone, I had no signal until I got closer to town. I pulled up the Airbnb listing to send a message, but it was gone, completely removed. The page just said, "This listing is no longer available." I never got an answer about who was upstairs. Maybe it was a squatter, maybe the host rented it out under the table, or maybe someone was just living there without saying a word. All I know is I paid for quiet countryside and ended up with something that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. I don't stay in rural AIRBNBs anymore. I booked the place because it looked clean and simple, nothing fancy, just what I needed for a couple of nights in town. The pictures showed a cozy living room with a sofa bed, a small kitchen, and a separate bedroom with a queen mattress. It was cheap, it had good reviews, and I didn't think much past that. When I got there, the host met me at the door. He was polite but had this way of steering me around, like I wasn't free to just walk in and explore the place myself. He carried my bag inside even though I told him I could handle it, then set it right by the sofa bed in the living room. He told me that was the best place to sleep, that it was more comfortable than the bedroom. I thought it was odd, but I didn't argue. The sofa bed was made up already with clean sheets and a pillow. I noticed the door to the main bedroom was shut and locked, which struck me as strange since the listing had clearly shown it as part of the rental. I asked about it in a casual way, but he just said, "Oh, that's for storage now," and moved on. Something about the quickness of that answer made me uneasy. That first night, I lay on the sofa bed, trying to convince myself it didn't matter. A locked room wasn't unusual. Maybe it was just the owner's personal space, even if that hadn't been mentioned online. I slept lightly, though. Every creak in the house made me open my eyes. The house wasn't big, so any sound carried. At one point in the night, I thought I heard something like running water, but when I got up to check, nothing was on. The bathroom sink was dry. The next morning, the host dropped by. He let himself in with a spare key, saying he just wanted to check on things. He lingered longer than necessary, asking how I slept, asking if the sofa was comfortable. He didn't mention the bedroom, and I didn't bring it up again. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It gnawed at me, the idea that something was off. That night, after he left, I walked over to the bedroom door. I pressed my ear against it. At first I heard nothing, just silence. Then, faintly, there was this smell. It wasn't strong enough to knock me back, but it was there, metallic, damp, mixed with something chemical like bleach. I pulled back, my heart starting to thump in my chest. The lock wasn't fancy. It was one of those old push-button types you could open with something thin. I hesitated, telling myself it was wrong to go snooping, but I also felt like if I didn't check, I'd never sleep again in that house. I found a thin metal piece from the kitchen drawer, slid it in, and the lock popped. The room was dim. The only light came from the hall behind me. I stepped inside and saw the mattress first. It sat on the floor, bare except for sheets that looked like they had been pulled on in a rush. Large, uneven dark stains covered it, spread across the center and sinking into the fabric. The air was damp, and the smell hit me stronger. Iron and bleach mixed together. I pulled the sheets back, and my stomach turned. The stains weren't old. They were still wet. When I touched the fabric without thinking, something thick and cold seeped into my hand. I recoiled, wiping it on my jeans, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung. In the corner, against the wall, were stacks of cleaning supplies. Bottles of bleach, rolls of paper towels, rubber gloves, trash bags. Some bottles were half empty. Others looked like they'd just been opened. They weren't dusty, and the plastic was still slick from being handled recently. The trash bag box was missing a few, which made me wonder where they had gone. I felt lightheaded. It wasn't just the smell. It was the thought of what those stains might be. The mattress looked like it had soaked up something awful, and the fresh cleaning supplies meant it hadn't been sitting there long. Someone had tried to scrub it, maybe even hours before I arrived. I backed out of the room, shut the door as quietly as I could, and locked it again. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my bag in silence, trying not to make any sound that might carry. Every shadow in the room made me tense. Every tick of the clock felt louder than it should have been. I checked the time. It was almost midnight, but I didn't care. I picked up my bag, opened the front door slowly, and stepped outside. The night air was cool and sharp, and I felt like I could breathe again. The driveway was empty, no car, no sign of the host. I didn't want to think about where he might be or when he'd come back. I walked fast down the street, then broke into a half-run once I was out of sight of the house. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway. I sat outside under the harsh lights, my bag at my feet, trying to steady my hands. I didn't call the host, didn't leave a note, nothing. I booked a cheap motel from my phone and walked there. The next morning, in daylight, it hit me harder. That mattress, those stains, the smell, the cleaning supplies, it wasn't normal. No one rents out a place with a room like that unless they're hiding something they don't want anyone to see. I thought about how he had insisted I sleep on the sofa, how he had kept the door locked, how he had lingered in the house like he was keeping watch. It made sense now. He didn't want me near that room. I reported the listing to the site, flagged everything I had seen. They removed it within the day, no explanation given. I never heard from the host again, never got a message asking why I left, never an apology. Nothing. It was like he vanished along with the listing. Even now I think about it. I think about what was on that mattress, why it was still wet, and what those cleaning supplies had been meant for. I wonder if anyone else had stayed there before me and seen the same thing. I wonder if someone didn't make it out. I tell myself I was lucky. I didn't argue with him, I didn't stay curious too long. I didn't try to confront him. I just left. That's the only reason I'm able to sit here and write about it instead of ending up as another stain on that mattress. I booked the place because it looked simple, quiet, and cheap. The pictures showed clean white walls, a wooden floor, and a bed under a skylight. The listing called it a minimalist loft, great for couples. I wasn't traveling with anyone, but I liked the idea of space to myself. The reviews were short and vague, but all positive. Nobody mentioned anything odd, just things like cozy, affordable, and perfect for a weekend. When I first arrived, the place looked exactly like the photos. A narrow staircase led up to a small open loft with a low bed pushed against the wall. A tiny kitchenette sat under the loft with a narrow table and 2 chairs. Everything was neat. It smelled faintly of cleaning spray, like lemon. The bathroom was tucked in the back with a sliding door. I tossed my bag down, checked the fridge, and unpacked my things like normal. Nothing stood out. That first night, I lay on the bed scrolling on my phone before going to sleep. I glanced up at the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling above me. Something about it caught my eye. It wasn't flat against the ceiling like most detectors. It was tilted, angled slightly down toward the bed. At first, I brushed it off as sloppy installation, but it stuck in my head. I've stayed in a lot of rentals, and smoke detectors are almost always flat against the ceiling. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it looked. Finally, I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it up at the detector. What reflected back didn't look like the smooth white plastic of a normal sensor. Instead, I saw 2 small black circles like glass lenses. I felt a jolt run through me. I sat up and stared harder. I grabbed the chair from the table, stood on it, and twisted the detector off the ceiling. It wasn't even wired. It was hollow, light in my hand, with a tiny lens and wiring inside. Camera. I stood frozen, holding it, listening to the silence of the loft. My first thought was denial. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it was some weird off-brand detector with a strange sensor. But the longer I looked, the clearer it was. It was a hidden camera pointed directly at the bed. I set it on the counter and began scanning the room with my phone flashlight. The clock by the bed caught my attention next. It looked normal at first, a cheap digital alarm clock, but when I tilted it in the light, I saw another dark circle where no button should be. The tiny lens glared back. My stomach dropped. I picked it up, turned it over, and found wiring too clean to be cheap. Another camera. I felt heat rising up my neck. My breathing was fast, shallow. I kept looking around. The vent above the kitchenette, a small metal grate with slits, had something glinting inside. I climbed up again and shined my light through. Another dark circle behind the slats. I opened the bathroom door. My hands were shaking now. The mirror over the sink looked normal. But when I leaned close, I noticed a faint square outline in the corner. I pressed against it, and the glass felt uneven. A camera lens was hidden inside the mirror itself, angled toward the shower. I stood there staring at it, my throat dry, my ears ringing with my heartbeat. I felt exposed, like someone was watching me at that very moment. My first instinct was to leave right then, but it was past midnight. I was in an unfamiliar town with no other room booked, no friends nearby, and I didn't want to be out wandering around with my bag in the dark. I forced myself to think. I unplugged the clock camera, pulled down the fake smoke detector, and shut the bathroom door. But the vent was built in, and I couldn't touch the mirror without smashing it. For all I knew, there were more cameras I hadn't even found. I sat at the table with the items I had pulled down. I felt sick, like the walls were closing in. Every corner of the room seemed dangerous now. I turned my phone camera toward the vent and mirror, recording them just in case I needed proof. I barely slept. I lay in the bed with my clothes still on, staring at the skylight above. Every sound outside made me jump. A car passing, a dog barking somewhere down the street. It all felt tied to the fact that someone, somewhere, had been watching. The next morning, I packed quickly, double-checking that I had all my things. I carried the fake smoke detector and the alarm clock with me, zipped in a side pocket of my bag. When I stepped outside, the air felt different. I noticed for the first time how quiet the street was. The loft was attached to a larger house, though the rental had its own entrance. The main house's windows were closed, curtains drawn. I didn't knock. I didn't want to see who lived there, didn't want to look anyone in the eye. I walked fast to my car, heart hammering, expecting the host to step out at any second. I drove to a nearby cafe, ordered coffee I barely touched, and connected to the Wi-Fi. I looked up what to do. Everything I read said to contact the platform, contact the police, and don't go back. I filed a report through the rental site first, attaching the photos and video I had taken. Then I called the local police. My voice shook as I explained. They told me to bring the devices in. At the station, I laid the fake detector and the alarm clock on the counter. The officer who checked them barely raised an eyebrow, like he had seen it before. He asked for the address, asked if I had noticed anyone recording me or entering the unit. I said no, just the cameras. He wrote everything down, bagged the devices, and told me they'd investigate. Walking out of the station, I felt drained, like my body was running on empty. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The thought that someone had watched me without my knowledge was like a weight pressing down on my chest. I never heard the end result of the investigation. The rental disappeared from the site within a few days, and my report was marked as handled. I received a refund and a generic apology email, but that didn't erase the feeling. For weeks, every time I stayed anywhere, hotel, rental, even a friend's house, I scanned the ceilings, the clocks, the vents. I'd shine my flashlight at smoke detectors before bed, tapping mirrors to see if they were hollow. It's been a long time since that night, but I can't look at any rental listing the same way. I don't see minimalist or cozy anymore. I see empty white walls hiding something I might not notice until it's too late. And even now, I can't shake the thought that whoever set up those cameras has hours of footage of me, stored somewhere I'll never find. Footage I can't take back because I never knew I was giving it to them in the first place. I booked the cabin because it looked simple, quiet, and out of the way. The photos showed wood paneling, a stone fireplace, and a small deck that overlooked the trees. It seemed like a good place to shut myself away for a weekend, somewhere I could read and rest without neighbors or traffic. The drive out there was long, most of it winding roads that cut through woods that felt older than the road itself. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, and the cabin was already dark against the trees. Inside, it smelled of pine and dust, not unpleasant but definitely aged. The living room had a low couch, a rug that had seen better days, and a coffee table with a thick book sitting right in the center. At first, I thought it was some kind of guidebook, maybe with instructions for the cabin, but when I sat down and flipped it open, I realized it was a guestbook. People had been writing in it for years, each page filled with scribbles from strangers who had stayed before me. The first few entries were harmless. Couples talking about anniversaries, families describing the trails they hiked, comments about the quiet nights and the sound of owls in the trees. It felt normal, the sort of things you'd expect in a rental like this. But when I flipped further back, the tone changed. The handwriting grew shaky in places, rushed like whoever had written it was nervous. One note stood out on its own page. "Don't sleep in the master bedroom. The man comes at 3 a.m. The words were underlined twice. I read it a few times, half expecting it to be a joke, but the way it was written didn't feel funny. It was tight, scratched deep into the page like the pen had nearly torn the paper. A few pages later, there was another one. "We tried to leave but couldn't. If you're reading this, good luck." I set the book down, trying to shake off the unease. It was probably some prank that past guests added, a way to spook whoever came next. Old cabins had that effect on people. Shadows stretched differently. Every sound was sharper when you were alone. I tried to laugh it off, but when I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, I noticed how quiet it was outside. No crickets, no wind moving through the trees, just silence pressing against the windows. The cabin had 2 bedrooms. The smaller one was cramped, barely enough room for the bed and a dresser. The master was larger, with a wide bed pushed against the wall and a window that looked straight into the woods. I thought about that note again, but told myself not to be stupid. I set my bag down in the master and unpacked slowly. That night, I kept the lamp on longer than usual. I read until my eyes burned, and when I finally turned off the light, the dark of the room felt heavy. I checked the time on my phone before setting it on the nightstand, 2:12 a.m. I shut my eyes, but they wouldn't stay closed. Every little creak in the cabin made me lift my head. At some point, I realized I was waiting for 3 a.m. Even though I didn't want to admit it, I was counting the minutes. When the phone screen lit up again, the time read 2:59. I stared at it until the numbers shifted. 3 o'clock. Nothing happened. The silence went on. I laughed under my breath and rolled over, trying to bury my face into the pillow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the sense of movement. My eyes flicked toward the window, but it was just black glass. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made coffee and sat out on the deck. The woods were still, the air cool, but I kept catching myself glancing at the tree line like something might step out. I thought about leaving right then, but it was paid for, and I didn't want to give in to some dumb guestbook prank. The second night was worse. I tried sleeping in the smaller bedroom, thinking maybe I'd feel better in there. The bed was stiff, and the air was heavier, like the walls were holding something in. Again, I found myself watching the time. When it rolled over to 3 a.m., the silence broke. Not with footsteps or voices, but with the sound of a door latch clicking. I froze. It was faint, but I knew I had locked both doors. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The house settled again, but I couldn't relax. I got up, slow and quiet, and walked into the living room. Both doors were closed, still locked. I checked every window latch. Everything was in place. When I came back to the small bedroom, I noticed the guestbook sitting on the coffee table again. I knew I had left it closed, but now it was open halfway. I stood there staring at it. My brain told me I probably forgot, but I knew I hadn't. I packed my bag right then, stuffed everything into it, and carried it to the car. I didn't even bother turning out the lights. The cabin looked wrong behind me, too dark against the trees, the windows too reflective. Driving back down those winding roads, I felt a strange pull to keep checking the rearview mirror. Every time I did, I half expected to see someone sitting in the back seat. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was coming up, but I was still gripping the wheel tight. I never wrote in the guest book. I never even thought about it until days later. I just kept remembering the handwriting, the words scratched into the page. They had felt so desperate, like they weren't written to scare someone but to warn them. I think about the people who stayed there before me. I wonder how many of them ignored the words like I almost did. I don't know if what I heard was real or if the place just worked its way into my head. But I do know I'll never rent another isolated cabin again. Some places hold too much. Not stories, not legends, just weight. Something that sits in the walls, in the silence, pressing on you until you break. When I finally got home, I left my bag by the door and didn't unpack for 2 days. I couldn't stop thinking about how normal everything looked in daylight, how easy it would be to believe nothing happened. But at night, when the house is quiet and the clock hits 3 a.m., I still catch myself holding my breath, waiting. I was on the 3rd week of my road trip when I booked the Airbnb. I had been driving all day across empty highways, stopping only for gas and coffee. By the time I pulled into the small town, the sun was low and I was exhausted. I had chosen this place because the listing showed a cute little apartment above what looked like a busy street lined with cafes, shops, and colorful awnings. The photos showed bicycles leaned against storefronts, flower boxes on windows, people sitting at outdoor tables with coffee cups. It looked safe, lively, and almost too perfect for the price. That should have been my first warning, but I was tired, and the reviews seemed fine, so I ignored the doubt. When I drove down the main road, I knew something was off. There were no cars parked anywhere, not even an old truck or a stray bike. The buildings that were supposed to be shops were all boarded up. Windows covered with plywood, doors chained shut with rusted locks. Signs that should have been swinging outside the cafes were broken or faded. The air felt heavy and still. No voices, no traffic, not even a dog barking in the distance. My tires made the only sound, crunching against loose gravel as I pulled into the spot listed in the Airbnb directions. The building itself was a narrow brick place, same as in the pictures, but the photo had clearly been taken years ago. In reality, the paint on the trim was chipped, the windows were dirty, and the front door was cracked open just enough to show darkness inside. I felt my stomach tighten. Normally, I'd have left right then, but I reminded myself that small towns can be strange. Maybe it was one of those places that had been busier a decade ago and then died out. I told myself it would just be one night, a place to sleep before getting back on the road. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit me first. It wasn't rotten exactly, but it was stale, like no one had opened the windows in years. Inside, the place was dim, with only the last light of the day coming through the thin curtains. The living room had a couch, a chair, and a small table. On the counter in the kitchen, right where the instructions said it would be, sat the key. The weird part was that the door had already been open. Why would the host leave it like that? It felt less like a welcome and more like someone had left in a hurry. I put my bag down and tried to shake it off. The furniture looked clean enough, though old. There was a faint layer of dust on the shelves, but the sheets on the bed seemed freshly washed. The fridge hummed quietly when I opened it, though it was completely empty. That detail made me uneasy, too. No ketchup bottle left behind, no carton of eggs, not even baking soda. It was like no one had ever really lived there. I pulled out my phone to check the Wi-Fi. I thought maybe I could distract myself, look up the history of the town, or at least message a friend to let them know where I was. The available networks loaded slowly, and when the list came up, only one showed. The name stopped me cold. Don't stay here. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for other signals to pop up, but nothing else appeared. No regular router names, no Linksys or Xfinity, just that one. The signal strength was strong, full bars, like it was coming from the apartment itself. My chest tightened. I didn't connect. I just turned the Wi-Fi off completely and sat down at the table. I could hear my pulse in my ears. For a moment, I thought about grabbing my bag and leaving, but it was already getting dark, and I had no idea how far the next town was. I kept telling myself there was probably some stupid explanation. Maybe it was a local kid messing around. Maybe someone had renamed their router as a joke. I tried to make it sound normal in my head, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. As the night fell, the silence of the town grew heavier. I'm used to quiet when I camp or stay in rural places, but this was different. There were no crickets, no cars passing on a highway in the distance, just absolute stillness. I walked to the window and looked down at the street. Every building was dark. The lampposts didn't turn on. I could see weeds breaking through the cracks in the pavement. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned years ago. Yet here I was, in an unlocked Airbnb, with clean sheets on the bed and a working fridge. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the old building made me sit up. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, but the sound of gravel shifting, like weight being put on it. I held my breath and listened. It didn't continue, but I couldn't shake the idea that someone was standing in the street. I didn't have the courage to move the curtain to check. I laid back down but didn't sleep much. My body was tense, ready to spring up at the slightest sound. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to stay another night. I grabbed my bag, checked the corners of the room like I expected someone to be there, and stepped outside. The sun was already up, but the town didn't look any different. Empty, dead, lifeless. The only change was that on the sidewalk near my car, I saw fresh footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. I had parked late, and I knew where I'd walked. These were heavier, leading toward the front door of the Airbnb. They stopped at the entrance, like someone had stood there for a while before turning back. My hands shook as I unlocked my car. I didn't bother double-checking the apartment or leaving a message for the host. I just drove. The GPS showed the next town was 30 miles away. When I finally saw a gas station, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I looked up the Airbnb listing again, thinking I'd leave a review to warn others. The page was gone. No listing, no photos, no trace that it had ever been there. I've stayed in a lot of strange places on road trips, but nothing has ever stuck with me like that night. The open door, the key waiting on the counter, the silent town with boarded windows, the Wi-Fi name, the footprints that appeared overnight. I'll never know who left that warning or who walked up to the door while I tried to sleep inside. But I do know this, I trust my gut now. If a place feels wrong, I don't stay. That was the first and last time I ignored it.